often, the powers vested in a president by the Constitution don't add up to the actual power needed to get things done. In order to expand the reach of the office, a president must have shrewdness and a bold personality and favorable times, a rare combination of factors that only about a dozen of our chief executives have had in their favor. All three of those factors fell into place back in the 1830s with our seventh president, Andrew Jackson. In 1845, just as photography was beginning to spread through America, Andrew Jackson was 78 years old and died. He didn't want to sit for a portrait. He was frail and didn't feel well. When he saw his image on a silver-coated copper plate, he said simply, "Humph, looks like a monkey." But etched into the face that was captured for all time in these daguerreotypes are the battle scars of frustration, in part the result of one of the most intense fights ever to occur between the Senate on one side and the White House on the other. Jackson's struggle, he said, was for the very nature of the presidency and who, ultimately, it belonged to.
Before Andrew Jackson, you'd had a whole series of presidents who would today be called upper middle class, leading citizens, all from the eastern seaboard. Andrew Jackson, coming from the West, represented that part of the country that had been built up from nothing after the Revolution. He was not upper middle class in any way, shape, or sense or form. The difference between him and the long line of Jeffersonians was in part social and very important.
Andrew Jackson's humble beginnings in South Carolina forged a toughness and a sense of righteousness that he would carry with him to the presidency. He rose to become a major general in the militia and Tennessee's first U.S. congressman. But all his life, he was also known as a man not to cross.
I am unfitted by taste and habit for the subtleties of the politician. I have too many enemies. They would tear me out of my grave to injure my character.
Anyone who insulted him was challenged to a duel. On one occasion, he cold-bloodedly took aim and shot his opponent dead.
Of all ideas, to me it is most humiliating to be thought to cringe to power. My reputation is dearer to me than life.
He settled on a large estate near Nashville, which he named the Hermitage. Jackson turned it into a working plantation, and it was the only place where he was content and able to relax. But with the War of 1812, Jackson's fiercer personality surfaced, and he left home to battle Indians in the backwoods of Tennessee.
The cry was raised from east to west for permission to carry a war into the Creek Nation. The object was to exterminate them.
A war against Indians was part of a war with England, and Jackson's victory against the British at the Battle of New Orleans turned him into America's greatest living hero. By 1828, Andrew Jackson was elected the 7th President of the United States, promising to turn over government to the common man.
Andrew Jackson became president in a populist reaction against a long line of presidents whose succession, one after the other, was arranged by bargains made within Congress. The main thing Jackson did was change the practice that his predecessors had got used to, throw out the conventions they'd got used to. But he also was admired for the kind of plain speaking that tough men in small towns and the countryside of the developing frontier would feel at home with.
He was sworn in at what was called the People's Inaugural. And for the first time, the White House was opened wide to the public, with thousands of ordinary Americans swarming in to celebrate their hero. In the elegant East Room, Jackson would soon install 20 spittoons. At 6'1" and weighing less than 140 pounds, Andrew Jackson was often sick in the White House and coughed up blood caused by an old dueling bullet lodged near his heart. To ease his pain, he sometimes bled himself, using his penknife to open the veins. Washington soon learned how charming Jackson could be, and he surprised many with his honesty and his thoughtful intelligence. But as he began to wield power inside the executive mansion, Jackson also demonstrated just how fierce he still was, especially towards Native Americans. In an effort to gain more than 100 million acres, Jackson insisted on their removal to territory beyond the Mississippi River.
Those tribes cannot exist surrounded by our settlements. They have neither the intelligence nor the moral habits. Established in the midst of a superior race, they must disappear.
The Cherokees would come to call the forced expulsion their Trail of Tears. Daniel Webster declared it a glaring example of Jackson's abuse of power.
I am denounced as a man of revengeful temper, with a tomahawk in one hand and a scalping knife in the other. Many conceive me to be a ferocious animal.
Throughout his presidency, Jackson picked fights, just as he had done all his life. He forcefully stood up for the federal union, opposing an early secessionist movement. And in his legendary duel with the Senate, Jackson made his single most ferocious bid to increase presidential power. The fight was over the future of America's centralized economy, which since the early days of the Republic had been controlled by the giant and now corrupt Bank of the United States. Jackson wanted to democratize the system so that small banks could compete across the country. He called the U.S. Bank the Hydra-headed beast, and he intended to slay it.
Until I can strangle the Hydra, I will not shrink from my duty. Unless the corrupting monster shall be shraven of its ill-gotten power, my veto will meet it frankly and fearlessly.
Jackson's veto of the federal bank's recharter would set a permanent new course for America's economy. His opponents called it the act of a willful tyrant.
Andrew Jackson was labeled King Andrew on the grounds he was being arbitrary because he was exercising powers in a way nobody had done before. It had been thought before the veto, at least it had been said, that the veto should only be used by a president to protect his constitutional position. Andrew Jackson said, "I can use it for any damn thing I want to. I am an independent power." And something in Jackson's strength, his determination, his will conveyed itself to contemporaries. Oh, and that's an important element of power quite beyond the Constitution.
The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it. I am ready with the screws to draw every tooth and the stumps.
When the Senate passed a resolution of censure against him, an action never taken before or since, Jackson fired back that a president was not responsible to the Senate, but solely to the American people.
The people are the sovereign power. The officers are their agents.
In the end, Jackson won his fight with the bank, and by it he demonstrated an extraordinary power shift. that by wielding the veto like a weapon, it would be the president, not the Supreme Court and not the Congress, but the president, who is the chief power in government. In part because of his simple roots, Jackson was the first president willing to stand up for working-class Americans and help the nation become more of a true democracy. Through his difficult and often frustrating efforts during 8 years in office, Andrew Jackson helped define what would become the modern presidency.
I think Jackson bore frustration, sometimes with enormous irritation, but with a certain nobility. He developed powers which had not been used before, but to a later generation, they are now so used that nobody would be struck by them. What he did in the presidency, we would now regard as super conventional. He may have scared some of his contemporaries, but he has left a deep and respectful imprint on the historians.
In 1837, Andrew Jackson returned home to his beloved plantation. Fellow Democrat James K. Polk would call him the greatest man of the age.
Strange as it may appear, my nerves are as steady as they were 40 years gone by. It is possible that friends are overawed by power. It cannot overawe me.
In the half-century after Jackson, no president came close to having his powers except Abraham Lincoln. But Lincoln's powers were emergency powers only, war powers, he called them. And in the Civil War's aftermath, Congress seized back its authority. By the 1880s, some were even predicting the demise of the presidency. But then came Grover Cleveland. Sworn into office on March 4th, 1885, Stephen Grover Cleveland seemed to many like a new Andrew Jackson. He had the same toughness and incorruptibility, and as with Jackson, Cleveland's power struggle would be with the Senate. His weapon was his enormous, stubborn integrity. It was a quality instilled in him as a youth.
I remember well my early days. I've always felt that my training as a minister's son has been more valuable to me than any other incident of my life.
Much of Cleveland's life was spent holding low-level political offices in Buffalo, New York. He was a man of the people whose passion for food and beer turned him into a 250-pound powerhouse. And as a loyal and hard-working Democrat, he became known for his high moral standards.
A Democratic thief is as bad as a Republican thief. I'm a sound, plain, uncomplaining Democrat.
People called him ugly honest, and by the 1880s, his popularity had become contagious. He was elected Buffalo's mayor, then New York's governor. And just a year after that, in 1884, the 47-year-old bachelor was running for president.
Cleveland managed to convey an impression of seriousness and honesty and reform-mindedness in middle-class terms that Republicans had been, for a number of administrations, claiming but not performing on very well. He was popularly regarded as an honest man. This was an enormously refreshing matter, and this is not something one does without effort.
But his reputation was challenged during the campaign when he was accused in the press of consorting with prostitutes.
I've never seen a woman whom I've had any reason to suspect was in any way bad. I'm at a loss to know how such wicked lies can be invented.
Then Cleveland was accused of having fathered a child in the 1870s and having abandoned both mother and son. The ridicule he suffered finally faded away, because of Cleveland's extraordinary dignity under fire. But the incident changed him. Though he won the election in November, he arrived in Washington with a bitter attitude, not only towards the press, but towards the presidency itself.
I look upon the 4 years to come as a dreadful self-inflicted penance for the good of my country.
From the start, Cleveland was determined to clean house and to reward deserving Democrats with jobs. But as he began suspending government bureaucrats and appointing new public officials, the Senate, which had become dominant in the 2 decades since Lincoln, refused to confirm them. Instead, they asked to see Cleveland's confidential files pertaining to his suspensions. A major power struggle had begun.
It was perfectly apparent that the issue was between the President and the Senate. The question was whether or not the executive was invested with the power to suspend officials without interference.
The Senate had underestimated Grover Cleveland. Asserting an early form of what would become known as executive privilege, Cleveland refused to comply with the Senate's requests.
These suspensions are my executive acts, based upon considerations addressed to me alone. I am not responsible to the Senate, and I am unwilling to submit my actions to them for judgment.
The American public, long starved for presidential leadership, voiced its approval of Cleveland's strong stance.
A president is someone whose formal constitutional authority won't get him most of the things he wants unless it's backed by popular approval, public approval, and by skill and will on his part to press the other participants in government to do what he wants. Getting popularity and keeping it, and exercising skill and maintaining will, those are things you have to add to formal powers if you want effectiveness.
The Senate soon realized it had met its match. Cleveland's appointments were confirmed, and the law permanently changed, empowering every president thereafter.
The President became again the independent agent of the people, invested with powers not to be surrendered, but used.
In the White House, Cleveland became one of the hardest working presidents ever, doing his own paperwork and routinely working past midnight, often until 2 or 3 in the morning. He paid his own expenses, dispensed with luxuries such as the presidential yacht, cussed openly, and bemoaned the fancy White House cooking.
I must go to dinner, and I wish it was to eat a pickled herring, Swiss cheese, and a chop, instead of the French stuff I shall find.
For the rest of his term in office, Cleveland continued to use his powers liberally. Andrew Jackson had been criticized for his unprecedented 12 vetoes. Cleveland used the veto nearly 600 times. But all too often, the bills he vetoed were bills that were popular with the people, and gradually he lost their support. By 1888, he was knocked out of office by Republican Benjamin Harrison.
The question, what shall be done with ex-presidents, is not laid to rest. I sometimes think, take them out and shoot them is worthy of attention.
But Cleveland wasn't ready to retire, and just 4 years later, the Democratic Party convinced him to run again. He became the only president ever elected to non-consecutive terms. Grover Cleveland's second inaugural took place just 2 months before the stock market crashed, sending the country into the worst depression ever felt to that time. At the height of the nation's financial emergency, Cleveland faced a personal crisis that would undermine his strength for the rest of his second term. For years, he had been a heavy smoker. Now he was diagnosed with a malignant tumor of the mouth.
Whatever developed found its opportunity in the weakened walls of my Constitution. I've learned how weak the strongest man is.
It was decided to proceed in utter secrecy so that news of the president's plight would not lead to new waves of financial panic. Cleveland traveled to New York City. He was taken aboard a friend's ship on the East River, where a team of 5 doctors and a dentist awaited him. Out at sea, he was strapped to a chair against the mast, given nitrous oxide and ether, and then was operated on for 41 minutes. His left upper jaw was entirely removed, and a large sarcoma successfully extracted. Cleveland spent the summer resting on Cape Cod, training himself to talk naturally with the aid of a rubber jaw. But the episode took its toll. He lost 60 pounds, his hearing was affected, and he became increasingly irritable and unwilling to compromise. But once back in the White House, Cleveland managed to stretch the powers of the presidency one last time, though in a manner that would damage his reputation. It happened when workers at the Pullman Car Company went on strike the next summer, leading to outbreaks of violence in the city of Chicago. Claiming he had a presidential right to intervene, he sent in armed federal troops to assume police powers.
Cleveland was the first president to assert that for the sake of a national economy, the president had a right to interfere in a labor dispute. It was not a very advantageous interference. Many people, including the governor of the state in which he interfered, Illinois, think they could have done much better without him. Regardless, that principle has been embedded in the presidency ever since.
Cleveland's actions earned him the title of dictator. The White House gates were now kept locked, his administration largely closed off to both the public and the press. By 1896, the public turned to William McKinley to take the place of Grover Cleveland.
I'm not the sort of man people want to hear in these days. My beliefs and opinions are unsuited for the times.
For more than a decade, he had been the dominant figure in U.S. politics, but his declining health and mounting inflexibility had ultimately undermined his ability to wield power. His greatest contribution had come early on in his struggle with the Senate over executive privilege. By his insistence upon his right to appoint the principal officers of government, Cleveland recaptured a constitutional power almost lost to the presidency.
The presidency is the repository of the people's power. The duty is only performed when the full exercise of the powers is insisted on.
Even a strong chief executive like Grover Cleveland saw his primary job as wielding a quiet hand behind the scenes, ensuring the smooth operation of the republic. But just 4 years after Cleveland, a new breed of president burst onto the scene. Theodore Roosevelt saw himself as a 20th century gladiator, infatuated with his own strength and power.
No individual ever led a really worthy life unless he possessed power. I believe in power. The timid man, the lazy man, has lost the great fighting virtues.
Some people thought at the time that Theodore Roosevelt was crazy. He became a health nut and an outdoors nut. He challenged the whole country to be as enthusiastic about conservation as he was, to be as enthusiastic about the West, to be enthusiastic about showing the flag, And I'm sure that that's the public side of all the effort he'd put in while developing himself. He forced himself to become what he naturally wasn't.
The secret of Teddy Roosevelt's obsession with power lay in his sickly beginnings and his struggle to live up to the expectations of his demanding father. Raised in the Civil War era into one of the most socially prominent families in New York, he was severely nearsighted and so racked with asthma he could barely breathe.
I was a sickly boy, nervous and timid. I had to train myself painfully and laboriously.
His father once told him, "Theodore, you have the mind, but you do not have the body. You must make your body." So over the years, Teddy Roosevelt compulsively lifted weights.
Oh, how little worthy I am of such a father. I feel such a hopeless sense of inferiority to him.
In 1878, while Roosevelt was attending Harvard, his father died of stomach cancer. As Teddy grieved, friends witnessed an aggressiveness that went out of control. One day, irritated by a neighbor's dog, he pulled out his pistol and shot the animal dead. Only when he married a young woman named Alice Lee was Teddy able once again to take pleasure in his life.
She is so marvelously sweet and pure and lovable and pretty that I seem to love her more and more every time I see her. Though I love her so much now that I really cannot love her more.
But on February 12, 1884, the day after Alice gave birth to a baby girl, Teddy's life shattered again. First, his mother died of sudden typhoid fever. Then, within hours, 22-year-old Alice also died of childbirth complications and undetected Bright's disease.
When my heart's dearest died, the light went out from my life forever.
In his grief, Roosevelt's aggressiveness went out of control again. He tore every picture of Alice out of his scrapbooks and burned all her letters, and he never again mentioned his wife's name. Leaving his infant daughter in the care of his sister, he headed west for the Badlands of Dakota to become a cattle rancher.
I owe more than I can ever express to the West. I herded my own cattle, killed my own food, shot bears, captured horse thieves. No one can understand the keen delight of lonely lands.
Roosevelt let solitude and open spaces and intense physical labor heal his broken heart. But more importantly, he taught himself how to channel his aggression into a unique form of energy with a purpose.
The only thing to do is treat the past as past. To dwell on it, and above all to keep talking of it with anyone, would be both weak and morbid.
In 1885, on a trip back east, he renewed an acquaintance with childhood playmate Edith Caro. The following year, they were quietly married and moved into Sagamore Hill, a Long Island mansion that had been designed for Roosevelt's first wife. Here they raised 6 children.
There could be no healthier and pleasanter place in which to bring up children than in that nook of old-time America around Sagamore Hill.
Sagamore Hill was Roosevelt's private retreat from the world and became a symbol of the man himself. Edith had little influence on the way it was decorated, and it came to look more like a hunting lodge than a home. Here, above his desk, Theodore Roosevelt hung a painting of his revered father. Still trying to live up to him, Roosevelt insisted that his own children stay active and physically fit.
I would rather one of them should die than have them grow up weaklings.
Over the next decade, Roosevelt climbed his way up a spiraling series of political appointments. He was Civil Service Commissioner under 2 presidents, then Police Commissioner of New York City, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President McKinley.
I rose like a rocket. I intended to be one of the governing class.
And when war with Spain erupted in 1898, he shipped off for Cuba as a lieutenant colonel in the Army. He fought alongside his own special regiment, known as the Rough Riders. And all his deep-seated aggressiveness had an outlet.
I killed a Spaniard with my own hand, like a jackrabbit.
His soldiers returned victorious, and Roosevelt became an instant war hero. It was then a meteoric rise to power. He easily won the governorship of New York. Then in 1900, the Republican Party chose him to run as the vice presidential candidate alongside McKinley. The new century began with their decisive victory. But just 6 months into his term of office, Roosevelt received word of McKinley's assassination. At 42, he was the youngest man ever to become president.
It is a dreadful thing to come into the presidency this way. I feel as if Father's hand were on my shoulder.
Teddy Roosevelt refused to recognize that he had now far surpassed the achievements of his father. So he kept pushing himself, and in doing so, he began transforming the office into what would become the modern presidency. Unlike Cleveland, he embraced the press, establishing the first official White House press room.
Theodore Roosevelt was the first president to exploit the first electronic medium, the wire services. He made absolutely the most he could of that resource. Teddy set out to be a great national source of entertainment, education and entertainment. He made his family a soap opera for the time and extended the presidency in so doing. He had a very active bunch of young boys, and he happily allowed to be publicized their adventures in the White House. The time they rode their pony up to the living quarters on the second floor was a national event.
When he wanted the public's support, he did what few presidents had ever done. He went out and asked for it. And with that support, Roosevelt began redefining executive power, claiming presidential authorities not specified in the Constitution. Going far beyond Andrew Jackson or Grover Cleveland, he insisted that a president could do anything he wanted for the good of the people, except what the law specifically prohibited.
Under this interpretation of executive power, I did and caused to be done many things not previously done by the president. I did not care a rap for the mere form and show of power. I cared immensely for the use that could be made of the substance.
As one of the country's earliest conservationists, he had a passion to preserve the American wilderness. To do so, he invoked a wartime power, the executive order, to forcibly acquire vast parcels of land from private hands. Then cajoling Congress into creating the Forest Service, doubled the number of the country's national parks and reserves.
I don't think any president ever enjoyed himself more than I did.
He also used the presidential power of persuasion, settling a volatile coal strike by becoming part of a mediation. He backed labor unions when he found them more willing to compromise in a crisis than the company owners. And in an age when a few rich men controlled much of the nation's wealth through monopolies, Roosevelt worked hard to make the trusts behave, becoming a hero with middle-class America.
Roosevelt managed to find ways of acting that would dramatize his words outside the realm of legislation. The president had a very limited role in legislation and overstepped it at his peril. He was very respectful of the powers that be, so much so that Harry Truman, years later when I worked for him, who'd been a young man in Teddy Roosevelt's time, used to refer to Theodore Roosevelt as that four-flusher. He talked a good game, but what legislation did he ever get through Congress? Teddy knew better than to get into a dogfight with the leadership of Congress, so he found acts to take that were outside the congressional realm. He masterminded and organized a coup against the country of Colombia, creating the state of Panama so that it would conclude a treaty for the Panama Canal.
His bold maneuvering in Central America was classic Roosevelt. First, he sent in his Navy to prop up a revolution, then did an end run around both Congress and Bogota to get what he wanted, the Panama Canal.
I do not think the Bogota lot of jackrabbits should be allowed to ball one of the future highways of civilization. So, I took the canal zone and let Congress debate, and while the debate went on, the canal did also.
In November 1906, Roosevelt journeyed to Panama to tour the construction. The first sitting president ever to travel outside the United States, he himself had become the symbol of United States dominance abroad. Regretting that he presided over an era of peace, Roosevelt tried to leave a military mark by doubling the size of the U.S. Navy. In 1907, he made a display of power no country believed possible. He sent the American fleet around the world. He considered it his last great accomplishment during his 7.5 years in the White House. Theodore Roosevelt was just 50 years old when he completed his presidency and returned to Sagamore Hill. To the end, he continued to channel his aggressions into productive energy, driven all his life by the ever-present influence of his father. "Every event of my life is tied up with him," he once said. "I almost feel as if he were present with me."
While president, I have been president. I have used every ounce of power there was in the office. If only my father could have lived and seen me in the White House.
In the decades after Theodore Roosevelt, presidential power continued to expand. FDR assumed wide-ranging new powers in coping with the Great Depression and with World War II. And once obtained, these powers were passed along to succeeding presidents. But with increased powers come increased dangers, as the nation's founders once predicted. And the delicate balance of power of the American system was finally brought to a testing point in the 1970s during the presidency of Richard Nixon.
It's very difficult to psychoanalyze oneself. Most people would give me rather low grades as far as, what do they call, charisma and gregariousness and all that sort of thing that the politician is supposed to have. The essence of virtually every great leader, and I'm not saying I'm great, but the essence of every great leader I have known, he was a lonely man.
All his life, Richard Nixon was a loner, and yet he chose the most public of professions, turning himself into a master politician, a congressman, a senator, and Dwight Eisenhower's vice president. In fact, he was still very much of a loner when he reached the presidency in 1969.
One finds when he got into the White House that he insisted on more privacy, more free time, more time away from people, more firm hierarchy in his staff than's been characteristic of our presidents. He insisted on having 2 free days a week when people were kept away from him. He was quite a strategist, Mr. Nixon was. More of a strategist than most of our presidents have been. But he wanted time to do that. He hated having to see people, having to deal with people. For a non-people person to put himself through a political career that culminates in the presidency is extraordinary. What was he proving? To whom was he proving it? But his stance was of a man who was always proving something to somebody. I read insecurity into that.
Richard Nixon was convinced that his ability to wield power was linked to his ability to prevent information from leaking out. From the day he took office, he cast a cloak of secrecy around his presidential activities. Not even his staff knew exactly what he was working on.
Unpredictability is the greatest asset or weapon that a leader can have. And unless he is unpredictable, he's going to find that he loses a great deal of his power.
Working secretly through his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, Nixon bypassed the State and Defense Departments. Once he pointed to the Oval Office and said, "There's the State Department."
We were obsessed with secrecy. As a matter of fact, I was paranoid or almost a basket case with regard to secrecy.
His presidential style alienated many outside the White House. But Nixon got results, compiling a distinguished record of domestic accomplishments. And he took rightful pride in his bold initiatives abroad.
I'm the president that opened relations with China after 25 years of no communication.
His opening of China electrified the world. And as a proponent of détente, he became the first president ever to visit the Soviet Union. It was Nixon who negotiated the first arms control agreement with the Russians. But despite his best efforts, Nixon's impressive achievements were often overshadowed by his handling of the war in Vietnam. Believing that military pressure would speed up the peace process, Nixon ordered the secret bombing of Cambodia, then Laos. When word of it leaked out, anti-war protests caged the president inside the White House.
We must realize that that is one of the necessary adjuncts of power. Those who have power are seldom popular.
From the nation's beginning, 3 great powers possessed by kings were deliberately withheld from the office of the president. The power to declare war, the power of the purse, and the power of immunity from legislative oversight. Richard Nixon proceeded to invade each of them. His presidency was now being called an imperial presidency. Despite his unpopularity in the press, Nixon successfully ran for a second term in 1972. But on the night of June 17th, operatives of his own private committee to re-elect the president were arrested after breaking into the Democratic Party's national headquarters at the Watergate building in Washington. 5 days later, Nixon was secretly recorded by his own White House tape recorder attempting a cover-up. Publicly, he denied all charges.
The inevitable result of these charges has been to raise serious questions about the integrity of the White House itself.
Power is poison, an historian once wrote, and for 2 years Nixon used his powers as president to try and derail the Watergate investigation. On October 20th, 1973, he ordered the firing of the Justice Department's special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, who had been granted wide-ranging independent powers to investigate the president. Attorney General Elliot Richardson resigned in protest, writing, "A government of laws was on the verge of becoming a government of one man."
Nixon now! Impeach Nixon now! Impeach Nixon now! Impeach Nixon now!
We're going to stay on this job till we get the job done. And let others wallow in Watergate. We're going to do our job.
When it was made public that tape recordings existed of his conversations in the Oval Office, Nixon tried to prevent their release, claiming executive privilege, just as Grover Cleveland had done 87 years earlier when he refused to turn over his files to the Senate. But unlike Cleveland's files, Nixon's tapes were pertinent to a criminal investigation. And on July 24, 1974, the Supreme Court unanimously rejected Nixon's assertion of executive privilege. On August 5th, his White House tape recordings proved Nixon had been part of an illegal cover-up. There was only one thing he could do now to stop the process hurtling towards impeachment. Nixon informed his Chief of Staff, Alexander Haig, of his decision.
I said to General Haig that I would resign, but it would be with dignity and with no rancor. And then I thought a minute and I said, "Well, Al, I really screwed it up, didn't I?" He didn't have to answer. I don't know how I got myself together, but I did, and went out and read the speech. That was the resignation speech of Thursday night.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Accused of abusing presidential power, he was the only president ever to resign from office. Congress would go on in the wake of his disgrace to repeal numerous statutes that had increased presidential power since FDR. All of it would be rationalized by what Richard Nixon had done.
Al Haig sort of knocked on the door. He brought one piece of paper. There was one line on it. He said, "You know, we forgot to do this. Would you sign it now? I hereby resign the office of President of the United States."
The breach of faith is not remembering what the White House has become over the years. The White House is to Americans in general a shrine. It is the place every president since Jefferson has lived. It's where Mr. Lincoln paced the floor. To forget that is, I think, to break faith. It's to forget that you are, at some level and in some part, the elected priest. You are supposed to be guarding the shrines. And to commit crimes in the people's house is unforgivable.
There's no way that you could apologize that is more eloquent, more decisive, more finite, or to say that you are sorry, which would exceed resigning the presidency of the United States. In politics, the friendships evaporate very quickly. That was an indication of how power goes away.
Strong presidents have always pushed their power to the limits. Andrew Jackson did it using his fearsome personality and by a decision to make vast new uses of the veto. Grover Cleveland threw all his massive weight and personal integrity into a fight with the Senate over the autonomy of the presidency. Theodore Roosevelt led the country by sheer exuberance and by doing anything he wanted within lawful limits. Richard Nixon, who worked so hard to shape a new world order, overstepped those lawful limits and broke faith with the presidency. The President of the United States is not a monarch. He is an officer within a constitutional government. A half-century ago, one presidential scholar described it this way: the president is a kind of magnificent lion who can roam widely and do great deeds so long as he does not try to break loose from his broad reservation. Power alone is not enough, nor are accomplishments. Above all else, a president must keep the public trust.